We're making American government and politics tenable. Presented by citizenu.org. Today's theme, interest groups. Today we'll be looking at the 10 critical words associated with interest groups. What role do the special interests play in our politics? The first word we have to look at is the mother's milk of politics, which of course is money. The primary means of influencing public officials begins with a noticeable campaign donation. Our perception as citizens is that money significantly tarnishes the integrity of our political process. We look upon interest groups, lobbyists, and the special interests with great disdain. Organized under the protection of the First Amendment's right to petition our government, there's little we can do. The mother's milk of politics, money. We're looking at interest groups. The following 10 words will make our interest groups more understandable, more tenable. Minority rights. The writers of the Constitution were reluctant to place ultimate power in the hands of majorities. Popular sovereignty is unmistakable, but so too are the safeguards given to minority rights. Republican forms of government are empowered to make principled decisions that are in the best interests of all the people. Minority rights. Can you think of constitutional safeguards that protect minority rights? When should majorities rule? Access points. The First Amendment protects our right to petition the government. In a federal system like ours, there are numerous access points to do this. These access points increase our efficacy, but they also make government vulnerable to corruption. Access points. Explain the advantages and disadvantages of having so many access points to our government. What did James Madison suggest about limiting the influence of interest groups in Federalist 10? Would he say the same thing today? Efficacy. Political efficacy is a basic measurement important to all successful democratic polities. Political efficacy measures how well the people understand their government. It also takes into account how responsive the government is to the people. Democracy is unthinkable without an electorate characterized by a high standard of efficacy. Efficacy. What is the best way to build high levels of political efficacy? Should a responsive government be the goal of our elected officials? 527s. Independent expenditures are a new and popular way to fly under the radar of campaign finance laws. Often called 527s, these relatively anonymous sources of unlimited campaign cash have changed the way elections are funded. Critical to 527s is that they must be independent from a candidate's campaign. No coordination between the two is allowed. "527s. Should independent expenditures like 527s be more closely regulated? What do you think the Supreme Court would say? Single-issue voting. With the decline of political parties and partisan ID, there has been a rise in single-issue voting. Interest groups have found they can mobilize voters more efficiently when focusing them on one highly charged wedge issue. Remember, at the core of any interest group is their desire to affect public policy one issue at a time. Single-issue voting. What are the most common single issues that mobilize voters? How do single-issue voters affect our political process? K Street. K Street is where the most powerful go to work. They are interest groups and advocacy groups whose corporate lodgings are found on this otherwise nondescript Washington street. Fundamental to democracy is the ability of the people to influence their government. Those factions who can best organize parlay that into the most influence. And where will you find these groups? K Street. K Street. What types of interest groups would you expect to find on K Street? What types are missing? Approval ratings. The most valuable commodity that interest groups possess is information. Interest groups publish approval ratings of various members of Congress. Approval ratings can substantiate popularity, but they can also humble the mighty. Information, after all, is power. Approval ratings. What are the advantages and disadvantages of our elected officials being influenced by the publishing of approval ratings? Lobbying. If your goal is to affect public policy at its highest peak, you should be encouraged to hire the services of a lobbyist. Lobbyists possess the information, the know-how, and the expertise to guide legislators and bureaucrats around complex issues. Employed by the special interests, lobbyists assure that the people's wishes are represented by those elected to serve. Often, however, lobbyists are perceived as tricksters and hustlers. Your view most likely will depend upon if your interests have been piqued. Lobbying. What qualifies one to be a lobbyist? What qualities make for a successful lobbyist? Executive orders and executive agreements. Executive orders relate to domestic policy, while executive agreements relate to foreign policy. Often seen as a unilateral stroke of the pen, executive orders and agreements have the force of law, yet do not require congressional approval. Executive orders and executive agreements. Why do presidents use executive orders and agreements? Should this practice be limited? Brown v. Board of Education. One of the most important court precedents in our history was rendered by the Warren Court back in 1954. With their unanimous decision in the case Brown v. Board of Education, our High Court struck down the separate but equal doctrine. The practice of legally segregating schools came to an end. The NAACP, a group advocating for minority rights, successfully used the courts to gain influence and subsequently equal rights for African Americans. Brown v. Board of Education. Assess the influence of the Brown decision today. What is the advantage of using the courts when interest groups try to influence policy? We're making American government and politics tenable, one word at a time. Today we looked at interest groups, presented by citizenu.org.